Let's move on to talk about how to actually apply the law of segregation. We'll do some Punnett squares and figure out how to solve genetics problems. Well, they're not problems, just how to figure out what the next generation is going to be. Now we're studying genetics, not Mendel, so we want to translate over some of what he talked about into sort of what we know about genetics today. So when he talked about characteristics, things like flower color, pea color, pod shape, that means the genes, right? The coding information made out of DNA. And then the different traits, so for the traits for flower color would be purple or white. And so those would be the alleles, the different versions of genes that we could possibly have. Remember, the law of segregation, super simple. Every organism has two traits and passes on one. Two alleles pass on one. We symbolized those last time with just some colored dots. We're going to use some letters to symbolize them now. Now I hope that in terms of understanding what's going on, it's really sinking in, that you're understanding this idea of having two traits and passing on one. But also when it comes to just testing your knowledge, I want to make sure that you don't make silly mistakes, because that's really the most common error. People rush through it, they skip some steps, kind of like in math, not showing your work. I know it's a bit of a pain, but there are 3 steps that I would recommend you try on every genetics problem. I've been at this for over 20 years, and I can do a lot of them in my head, but I still make mistakes, especially if I'm tired or stressed out. So just do yourself a favor and be real careful with it. The legend is simple. What is dominant? What's recessive? We know that purple flowers are dominant over white flowers. I tend to use the letter A for everything, just because it's simple. By convention, capital letters are dominant, so big A is purple and lowercase a are the white flowers. Now we always have something to refer to, just a good step to keep in mind. Now that we know this, instead of dots, we can say that this flower has 2 dominant alleles and symbolize it that way, and this one 2 recessive alleles. And that leads us to the next step. We almost always want to sum up the genotypes. Usually we're asked, here are the parents, what are the offspring going to look like? If that's the case, we need to know what the genotypes of the parents are, which we just did. Usually we put a little X to say we crossed them, we crossbred them. And then finally, know what the question is. We've not asked a question here. We've just been setting it up. So here's my setup, and it just corresponds to Mendel's original experiment. We had a true breeding purple flowered plant, true breeding white flowered plant. And then we might ask, for example, as a question, what color are the offspring going to be? Well, we know they all turn out purple, but let's walk through that in a couple of different ways. Let's start out with a real simple, just biological view of this. Same way Mendel probably would have looked at it. Here in this plant, I have the pistil, which contains these ovules, basically what will become the little peas, the seeds, but they have to be pollinated. And so this plant produces the pollen that we're going to transfer to this one. And so when that happens, then this allele combines with this allele, and we'll need another pollen grain to fertilize this one, and another pollen grain to fertilize this one. But when they combine, we know that every single time we're going to get a dominant allele from this parent and a recessive allele from this parent. And the question was, what color will the offspring be? We already knew they were purple, but in terms of going through this carefully, here's the genotype. That's not the color. We go back to our legend and say, what does that tell us? We have 1 dominant and 1 recessive allele. If it's dominant, that's going to show up, and so they are all going to be purple. And that's about all I need. I could have done the same thing over here without drawing that out and saying I'm going to pass on a dominant allele there and a recessive allele which again gives me only the genotype, but then I have to answer the question, what color will the offspring be? And I take this, refer back to my legend, and say all of them will be purple. There's no other options. Let's move on to something a little more complicated and try to solve it a couple different ways, one of which uses a Punnett square. Well, as an example here, let's use Mendel's F1 generation. And remember, for this, he allowed that plant to cross with itself. And we remember that these had a mix of dominant and recessive alleles, so they were heterozygous. So our genotypes look like that. And our question in this case is, what percent of the offspring would have white flowers? Let's work this a couple of different ways. Because all we're really trying to do is figure out, we have 2 and we pass on 1, what's going to result from that? And obviously there's a different combination. You already know the answer. It's 3 to 1, right? 3 purple for every 1 white flower. But how do we know that? Let me move this over here. So here are the 2 parent genotypes, right? They each have 2. I could either pass on the first one of each and get a dominant allele for both, so I could get that genotype. Or I could pass on the first one of this and the second of this, so it could be heterozygous. Or I could pass on the second one of this and the first one of this, or the second of each. I don't know if it reminds you of FOIL, first, outer, inner, last from algebra. Maybe that gives you some kind of anxiety-filled feelings, but that's one way of doing it. This then tells me all the possible combinations. Have I gone through all of them? Yeah, I've gotten every single one of these all set. There are my genotypes. Have I answered the question? No, I've not. It doesn't tell me the percentage of offspring with white flowers. Only this one, according to my legend, could have white flowers because there's no purple alleles present. So in this case, it's 1 out of the 4. Now, this is a prediction only. This is not saying there's going to be 4 P's or 4 offspring. There could be 400, 4,000, or just 2. This is not a prediction of how many offspring or exactly what will happen. These 2, by some weird chance, could have 15 different white-flowered offspring and none of the purple-flowered. But that would be really strange. So this is just a prediction, and that's all it is. But this gets a little bit cumbersome in some ways. When we had 2 homozygous individuals, it worked. I could just say it passed on a dominant allele, the other one passed on recessive, and that was it. But this becomes cumbersome. And that's where the Punnett square comes in. It helps us organize information a little bit better. So let's take a look at that. Probably seen the Punnett square before. It's just an organizational tool. So I don't want you to make too much of it. It kind of, in a way, separates us from the biology, which I always get a little concerned about. Mendel didn't use the Punnett square. It was developed, obviously, by Mr. Punnett, Reginald Punnett, in 1905 after the rediscovery of Mendel's work. But here's what we do. We take the genotype and we split up these 2 traits, because that's what the law of segregation says we do. So dominant, recessive for this one. We do the same for the other one over here, which really mimics the process of meiosis, which we'll study quite a bit later on. So there we go. Now we combine them inside of this square, which simulates the process of fertilization or pollination of this plant, where you get 1 allele from each of the parents. And you keep following that process, carrying this dominant allele over to here, this recessive allele down, and you just are filling it in. We're getting to get the same results as we did before, but it's just nice and neatly organized. So here we go. Question is, what percent of white flowered offspring would we get looking at all these? That has a dominant allele, so that's purple flowered, that's purple flowered, that's purple flowered. So again, just 25% of the offspring would have white flowers, according to this prediction. Doesn't mean they have to, but that's our prediction. And that's probably the simplest way of applying the law of segregation.